Clavicles. Your clavicles are the two bones that run horizontally across the top of your chest, from your sternum out to your shoulders. They look like a minor structural detail. They're actually the foundation of everything. Think of them like a coat hanger. The wider the hanger, the more the jacket spreads. The narrower it is, the more everything bunches together. Your clavicles work exactly like that, and no amount of training changes their length. You were born with them. You're stuck with them. Research on skeletal frame width consistently shows that biacromial diameter, the distance between your shoulder sockets, is the single strongest predictor of perceived shoulder width. More than muscle mass, more than training. The bone comes first. If you've ever trained for years and still feel like your shoulders just don't look wide enough, this might be why. Wide clavicles create that shelf, that overhang, that visual dominance. Narrow ones cap the ceiling no matter what you build on top. Arnold Schwarzenegger. Clavicles so wide his waist looked impossibly small by comparison, and his waist wasn't even that small. That's the illusion. Ronnie Coleman. A frame so broad it made 300 pounds look proportionate. Chris Bumstead. The modern blueprint, that width that dominates every room he walks into. The gym builds the muscle. The bones decide the shape. Waist. Your waist isn't just a measurement. It's the middle of the equation. Think of the physique like an hourglass. The top and bottom only look dramatic if the middle is narrow enough to create contrast. Without that contrast, even the widest shoulders in the room start to disappear. The waist is what makes everything else look bigger than it actually is. Here's what most people don't understand. Your waist size isn't just about body fat. Underneath the fat is bone, specifically your lumbar vertebrae and the width of your hip bones at the front. That bony structure sets a hard floor. You can diet down to 3% body fat and still have a waist that's wider than someone else's at 15, because the skeleton doesn't negotiate. If you've ever cut hard, lost the fat, and still felt like the taper just wasn't there, the bone was always the ceiling. Wide clavicles plus a narrow waist. That's the combination. That's the blueprint every great physique is built on. Sergio Oliva had it so extreme that judges at the 1969 Olympia couldn't find a single angle where he looked anything less than impossible. Chris Bumstead wins every year partly because of it. And Niall Darwin, 6'1", 28-inch waist, walks on stage and makes every other classic physique athlete look structurally outgunned. You can build the muscle, you can lose the fat, but the distance between those 2 points, that's decided before you walk into the gym. Hips. Your hip bones are the bottom half of the equation, and most people never talk about them because nobody wants to hear that their hips might be the problem. Think of the pelvis like the base of a building. A narrow base makes everything above it look taller, leaner, more tapered. A wide base does the opposite. It widens the silhouette at the bottom and fights every aesthetic ratio you're trying to build. For men, narrow hips are the structural jackpot. They make the waist look smaller without the waist changing. They make the legs look longer. They let the V-taper actually taper all the way down. Hip width is determined by the iliac crest, the outer edge of your pelvis. And like every other bone on this list, training doesn't touch it. If you've ever wondered why some guys look blocky no matter how lean they get, wide iliac crests, the fat comes off, the block stays. The best classic physique athletes alive share one thing below the waist: hips that disappear. Sebum. Ramon Dino. Their lower bodies frame the taper instead of breaking it. Wide shoulders get the attention. Narrow hips keep it. Chest depth. Most people train the chest. Almost nobody thinks about the cage underneath it. Your thoracic depth, the front-to-back measurement of your rib cage, is the platform your entire upper body sits on. Think of it like a stage. The deeper the stage, the more the performance has room to breathe. A flat rib cage compresses everything forward. A deep one projects the chest out naturally, adds thickness to the torso, and creates that barrel-chested look that reads as powerful from every angle. Your rib cage reaches its final dimensions by your late teens. After that, the only thing that changes is what you build around it. The bone itself is locked in. If you've ever trained chest for years and still felt like it looked flat from the side, the rib cage was always part of the answer. Jay Cutler had a rib cage so deep it gave his torso a thickness that looked almost architectural from the side. Arnold's chest projected so far forward it cast a shadow in side poses. That depth wasn't built, It was inherited. The muscle fills the chest. The rib cage decides how far it goes. Torso length. Your torso length is the distance between your shoulders and your hips, and in bodybuilding, shorter is almost always better. The femur to torso ratio is well documented in aesthetic analysis. Athletes with shorter torsos and longer legs consistently score higher in visual proportion assessments because the silhouette reads as more athletic and tapered even before conditioning is factored in. If you've ever felt like your midsection looks stretched, like there's too much space between your chest and your waist, torso length is probably why. Flex Wheeler had one of the shortest torsos in pro bodybuilding history. His muscle bellies were so compressed, it made his physique look almost digitally edited. Nick Walker has one of the longest torsos in the current open division. Compared to his legs, the midsection occupies so much vertical space that the whole silhouette loses the taper, no matter how conditioned he comes in. A short torso doesn't just look better, it makes everything you build look bigger than it is. Limb length. Your limb length, the proportion of your arms and legs relative to your torso, is one of the most misunderstood genetic variables in the sport. Think of it like a lever system. Longer limbs mean longer levers, and longer levers change everything. How you move, how you lift, and most importantly, how your muscle bellies fill the space between your joints. A shorter humerus means the bicep has less distance to fill, so it looks fuller and bigger at every stage of development, even before you've built that much mass. A shorter femur means fuller-looking quads. The muscle hasn't changed, the frame it sits on has. Muscle belly length is directly determined by the distance between joint insertions. Shorter bones create shorter gaps, and shorter gaps fill faster and look fuller at every stage of development. If you're built like a giraffe, long arms, long legs, joints that seem miles apart, every muscle you build has to travel further just to look like something. The gains are real. The distance just swallows them. Phil Heath's arms were relatively short for his height, which is a big part of why his biceps looked so obscenely full from every angle. The muscle had less space to fill, so it had no choice but to pop. Short limbs make the same amount of muscle look like twice as much. Height. Height is the one genetic variable everyone has an opinion on, and almost everyone gets it wrong. Think of height like a volume dial. Turn it up too much, and everything gets stretched. Limbs too long, muscle too spread out, the frame too big to ever look full. Turn it down too far, and the opposite problem hits. The structure looks compressed on stage, overwhelmed by taller athletes standing next to it. The sweet spot is narrow, and most people are outside it. Research on competitive bodybuilding consistently shows that the most decorated open athletes cluster between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 11 inches, tall enough to command presence on stage, short enough to fill the frame. In classic physique, the range shifts slightly higher, 5 feet 11 inches to 6 feet 1 inch, where height adds visual elegance without spreading the muscle too thin. If you're over 6'2" and wondering why your physique never looks as full as someone shorter with the same stats, the height is spreading everything thin. If you're under 5'7", you already know the feeling of standing next to someone taller and watching the comparison shift before a single muscle flexes. Arnold stood at 6'2" and made it work, but he needed clavicles the width of a door frame and 230 pounds of muscle to pull it off. Chris Bumstead, at 6'1", sits exactly in that classic sweet spot. Presence without the penalty. The structure does half the work before he even steps on stage. There's an ideal height for this sport. Most people just don't have it. Head size. Nobody talks about head size in bodybuilding, and that's exactly why it keeps surprising people on stage. Think of it like a reference point. Your head is the anchor the eye uses to judge everything else. A smaller head makes the shoulders look wider, the neck thicker, the entire frame more imposing by comparison. A larger head does the opposite. It compresses the visual scale of everything below it, making structures that are objectively massive look somehow ordinary. In visual proportion theory, the head-to-body ratio is one of the primary cues the brain uses to assess size and dominance. Athletes with smaller heads relative to their frame consistently read as bigger and more imposing, even when the measurements say otherwise. It's not subjective. It's how human perception is wired. If you've ever stood next to someone in the gym who clearly had less muscle than you, but somehow looked bigger, head size might be part of that equation. Ronnie Coleman had a remarkably small head for his size, which amplified every pound of muscle he carried. It made 300 pounds look like it belonged on a different species. Hunter Labrada, on the other hand, a larger head that, regardless of the mass he brings, shifts the visual scale just enough to change how the package reads on stage.